I was absolutely thrilled when Carol and Sandy asked if I would play this small role in an event honoring Rita Arditti. It's an honor to be associated with anything that is celebrating Rita's work. I was very lucky and first met Rita, oh gosh, in maybe the 1980s. I think Rita's one of the people that made me a feminist. I always felt when I was around Rita that Rita was even shorter than I am, if you can believe it. But Rita always seemed so tall. I'll just tell you a story. I used to use Rita's book, her fabulous book, which if you haven't read, you absolutely have to read, called Searching for Life, and it is the ultimate story of the women who created the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the anti-militarist human rights group in Argentina. And I would always assign Searching for Life to my students at Clark. And you know how it is when you read a book and you begin to imagine the author. I hate it when they put pictures of authors on the back of books, because I like people to kind of, imagine. So the students had all read the book, and they were so excited. They loved this book. They loved this book, Searching for Life. And so I had invited Rita, who's a wonderful speaker, I had invited Rita to come out and speak to a big public audience at Clark. And of course, my students were going to go. So just before the event that afternoon, I was meeting my students, and I said, well, so Alicia and Fed and Estelle will especially think this is funny. So I said to the students, so now that you've read this life-changing, exciting, smart book, what do you think Rita Arditti looks like? And they said, so they thought a minute, and they said, well, she has long dark hair, and she's tall. And I thought, well, that's right, because that's what authority is supposed to look like, right? And I said, and then I went out into the hallway and I brought in Rita. I said, let me introduce Rita Arditti, who is about up to here on me and definitely doesn't have long dark hair, at least not at that point. And they were absolutely overwhelmed. And then within 5 minutes, you could see that they totally changed their notion about what an authoritative voice was, because now it was somebody who was 5'1" with white hair, right? And it was just a lesson in Rita's commanding presence and her thoughtfulness. I want to bring greetings from several people who weren't come today, and then I'll introduce some of the important people that are here to celebrate Rita. And that is the co-founders with Rita of New Words Bookstore. New Words Bookstore, which some of you were lucky enough to go to, was founded in 1972 by Rita and 3 other Cambridge women. They didn't all know each other, but they loved books, and they wanted books by women and for women and about women to be publicly available, which in the 1970s was very hard to come by. You couldn't just find Adrienne Rich's poetry. You couldn't just find Audre Lorde's poetry. You could not find novels by Alice Walker. You could not find books like this. And you could not find Ms. Magazine. You could not find it unless you went to New Words Bookstore. So Rita founded one of the premier feminist institutions in the greater Boston area. She was somebody who broke new ground, thought new thoughts, dared to create something that nobody thought you could create. She's an absolutely fabulous person. I'm going to introduce several people who are going to talk more about their own working with Rita. But first let me introduce Alicia, who is one of Rita's sisters. Right there, raise your hand so everyone can see. And sitting right across the aisle here is Federico. Federico is Rita's son and is a fabulous filmmaker. And then Rita's longtime partner and co-conspirator, Estelle Dish, who you're all lucky enough to have here as a professor of sociology at University of Massachusetts, Boston. So we're going to have now several speakers who are going to come up and talk about their wonderful work with Rita. Rajini, I think you are the first. Rajini is associate provost here at UMass Boston and worked very closely with Rita in the creation of the really groundbreaking undergraduate major in human rights. So Rajini, it's all yours.
Thank you, Cynthia. This looks like one short person after the next. Yeah. Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you, Carol and Sandy, for having invited me to be a part of this really important day. I want to say it's a real honor to speak about Rita because it was an absolute privilege to know her. And I'll start by telling you how she was very instrumental in helping us to do our first human rights course on this campus. I met Rita in, I want to say 2000, about 2 years after I came to UMass Boston. And at the time, perhaps a year before I met Rita, she was part of a group that had been started in the College of Public and Community Service called the Human Rights Working Group. And there are, in fact, people who are part of that group who are sitting in the audience right here. And it was a very unique group on campus because it included faculty members, staff, students, and community activists. In that sense, I think it was quite unique and a very special group. And from the outset, the group was committed to hearing the perspectives of all of these various kinds of actors in the human rights world. And early on, we decided that our approach to human rights would be both local and global. So to see the intersections between local causes and sort of the global landscape of human rights. And we met, you know, I would say maybe once every month. And it was a really exciting group to be a part of. And there were several forums that were organized by this group. I remember one that, you know, Noam Chomsky came to speak at. And it was about, of course, the various human rights violations that we as a state had been complicit in Latin America. Shortly after that, we organized a forum, I think it was in 2002, on the impact of the USA Patriot Act in terms of the detentions and the deportations that were part of the global war on terror. We also had a forum that addressed the initiative to essentially squelch bilingual education in the K-12 system in Massachusetts. So this was a group that, you know, took on issues that were very relevant to our specific context here in Massachusetts, but then that also had both national and global consequences. We had also, as part of the Human Rights Working Group, conducted a survey of undergraduate students to determine their interest in the issue of human rights. And we found, well, not to our surprise, that there was an overwhelming desire on the part of the undergraduates to have courses in human rights. And so we took that as a sign that maybe we ought to develop something. And this was then a small group of us formed, I guess, a kind of curriculum committee, and we started to brainstorm what the first formal human rights course on this campus would look like. And once again, this curriculum development committee was made up of faculty members, students, and community activists. And Rita was the person from the community who was part of this curriculum development committee. There were 4 or 5 faculty members and 2 students, and it was a collaborative project of figuring out what kind of a course we wanted. We knew, since it was going to be the first course, formal course in human rights on this campus, and we were going to call it the Introduction to Human Rights, that we wanted it to reflect the complexity of this field. We decided that it would be multidisciplinary in approach, that it would be co-taught, and we made that commitment at the outset that it would be a team-taught course. The first two people who taught the course were Professor Zilora Chowdhury of the Women's Studies Department, and she's sitting here, and Amy Denowden of the Anthropology Department, and they taught that course twice. And in fact, I think it was the first time that we had a team-taught course that enrolled over 100 students, and thanks to the support of our then Dean, Donna Kaisinger, who immediately saw in this course an opportunity to fulfill a strong desire on the part of students. So we're very grateful to her for having made this course possible. The course was taught twice by Elora and Amy, and Rita sat in, I think, on the first teaching of this course. And Elora says, and I believe her entirely, that it was very, very, in some ways sort of intimidating to have a person of Rita's stature sitting in on your course, attending every class. And even though Rita would sit probably way in the back and not intervene, I mean, to know that you were being observed by someone as formidable as her, I'm sure was kind of scary. But one of the really important things about, Rita's presence and contribution to this course was that she wanted us to think about the relationship between human rights and education. So in two ways, what does it mean to have an education in human rights? What does that mean in terms of content? And what does it mean in terms of pedagogy? How do you fulfill a human rights education through the way in which you teach about it? And then the other question is, how does one ensure that a state fulfills the promise that education is a human right? So looking at it from both perspectives. And I think, Rita made very clear that she wanted us to keep those questions at the forefront of our course. As I said, Professor Zilora Chowdhury and Amy Denowden taught the course twice. In its third iteration, I taught the course with Michaela Parina, who's my colleague in the philosophy department, and we're actually waiting to teach it another time, and we're looking for volunteers. And it has to be a team-taught course. It would be really great if people who are interested in it would come up to either Elora or me, and we'd be happy to get you to teach it. I, since sort of using that course as an inspirational model, went on to develop a course specifically for the English department, which is called Literature and Human Rights, that I have taught myself twice now, and will be teaching again in the fall semester. And one of the texts I use for this course is a chapter from Rita's book, The Searching for Life, and it's the chapter I use is called The Grandmothers Organize. And what is really surprising to me is that every time I use this chapter, students will write back and say it was the most inspiring reading of the course. Because, those of us who work in the field of human rights know that just the particulars of human rights work and human rights violations can be very overwhelming, can sometimes be really despairing. Students sometimes feel, well, we're learning about all of these things, but seriously, how can we do anything to change the world? This is the question that always seems to preoccupy them. And then they read this chapter by Rita, and it transforms their thinking about their capacity to do something. They are so astonished that grandmothers, as they always say this, who would have thought that people whom no one would, sort of give credit to for being brave, for challenging the state, for being able to engage the attention of the world, for being able to enlist the aid of scientists. They're just astonished by all of the things that these grandmothers were able to accomplish. And so it inspires them, and I always wait to hear their response to this chapter, because I sort of introduce it when we're 2/3 of the way through the semester, when I think they're feeling pretty defeated about everything they've read, and it changes the tenor of the course entirely. So, I'm really pleased that Rita manages to inspire students and will continue to inspire them, because I plan on using this chapter always in my course. And therefore, I think it's just a great honor for me here to be standing and talking to you about her. And she's been really, really special to the human rights cause within UMass Boston. Thank you.
Then I'd now like to introduce John Beckwith, who is at Harvard and worked with Rita on an area of her activism that maybe some of us weren't aware of. She was a biologist by training, got her degree in Italy, didn't she? Yes. She was a very global person, and so John's going to talk a bit about the feminist activist politics of science. John.
I'm really happy to be here. I'll come back to this in a minute, but Rita, in fact, was one of the most influential people in my life.
That's good.
So I first met Rita in Italy, where she was going after her PhD at a place called the Istituto di Genetica e Biofisica. I just like to say Italian, so I say it. It's an institute that, because of that first visit there, I became very involved with over many years. I spent a sabbatical period there and was on the advisory board and just loved going back there. But each time I went back, there was something that I remembered before on the trip. There was some image I had of Naples, which was Rita's smile, which is one of the most wonderful smiles I've ever known on anybody. So I met her in '63 when I visited there. She came to Boston, I think in like 1965, to do postdoctoral work at Brandeis for a short time after getting her PhD. And then she came and asked if she could work in my lab in a postdoctoral position. I said yes. I was extremely happy to have Rita and the smile working with me. This was kind of the early days of molecular biology. Some of the big discoveries were made in the early '60s. And there was a funny kind of environment that I've looked back on in those days, that many of the discoveries were going to reflect universal truths of all organisms. In those days, we thought biology was very simple, and today we know increasingly that it's nowhere near as simple as we thought. And Rita was one of the people who made important contributions to expanding the complexity of what had been found and showing that things were not as simple as they thought. In particular, our lab was working on how genes are regulated. And two French scientists, François Jacob and Jacques Monod, had come up with a theory which really took hold of the whole field and was inherently correct in many ways, and very important in fostering the development of biology at that point. And that was that there were these proteins that bound to genes and shut them off so they couldn't work. Then there were ways of inactivating those proteins so they could work. And they proposed in many papers that this was the universal mechanism for how all genes were regulated. If there are some biologists in the room today, they'll know that there are thousands of mechanisms, although that was a very important one. And what Rita's work really helped elucidate, work she did in my lab, and also in collaboration while she was in my lab with a lab at MIT, that there was another way that genes could be regulated, and that is a protein could bind to DNA and turn on a gene, not shut off the gene. And that was a major set of contributions she made, the work between that done in my lab and in the collaboration with the professor at MIT. So she came to my lab in the late '60s and brought a strong political flavor to it. And back in the late '60s, some scientists were beginning to get involved in politics, and in particular, there was a group that was initiated in the late 60s called Science for the People, which incorporated people from many different fields, and they made a big splash at a local national conference of the American Association for Advancement of Science. And I was surprised to turn on the TV one day and see Rita. I can't remember if she's protesting or speaking, but very involved in this. And we had talked about it, but I hadn't really known what it meant. But when I talked about her enormous influence on me, what was really important was that she talked politics all the time, and with me, sort of convinced me in her smiling but very serious and effective way that this was something very important to pursue. And she was effectively one of the founders of this organization in the late 60s. I joined a little bit later. And then there was another change took place that was a very important change in that organization because of Rita, and that was after a couple of years, she and other women in the organization said, wait a second. And you know what they said, because it was what was going on everywhere. It's not a new story. And it was, in particular, even later on, when we were doing a critical look at sociobiology, she and others pointed out that sociobiology not only had issues related to race and class, but also to issues of women, which was, I hate to say it, but it was an eye-opener for us. Gee, you're right. As I said, she was enormous influence on me. I think that the depth to which I'm involved in politics, and basically all my teaching now, although I'm in a science department, is on science and the politics of science and its social consequences. That's really initiated and stimulated in me by having worked with this wonderful person. Thank you. I'm sorry to say I have to run to another, I have to be at a talk in Cambridge by 5 o'clock.
Yep. Thank you for coming, John. Yes, one of the things that Rita did, and you see this in Searching for Life as well, is she brought her exquisite knowledge of the science of biology into her political action. And one of the reasons that the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo managed to mobilize scientists, geneticists internationally is partly to do with Rita's work, and she shows that in her book, Searching for Life. The next person that is going to talk a bit about Rita's many, many sides is Ann Blum, who is here at UMass Boston and is the chair of the newly renamed Latin American and Iberian Studies program. Ann.
Somewhere in the middle here. Okay. How's that? Can you hear in the back? Thank you. Well, greetings. It's very gratifying to be here with you to honor the life and work of Rita Arditti, and it is my pleasure to say a few words about Rita's contribution to the field of Latin American studies. This may seem oblique, but let me start by noting that Latin American studies, like other area studies fields, emerged from Cold War imperatives to investigate regions considered strategic to U.S. policy. Latin American governments responded to U.S. geopolitical motives with terrifying creativity and used them to justify national politics by any means. Indeed, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Latin American governments, particularly in the Southern Cone, carried Cold War logic to horrific extremes. And I'm not talking about the atom bomb. It was national security doctrine that provided the supposed rationale for governments in the Southern Cone to wage war against their own citizens, whom they labeled subversives. In Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, the victims of those dirty wars were mostly young adults, many still adolescent. It fell to the surviving older generation to confront their children's murderers and grandchildren's abductors. Rita made profound contributions to exposing those horrors and celebrating the people who had the courage to confront them. First, as a scientist, both as a scientist and a humanist, she engaged with and gave ongoing support to the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo of Argentina and their campaign to discover the fate of their young adult children, to locate their grandchildren abducted and concealed by Argentina's military regime between 1973 and 1982, and to restore their grandchildren's rightful identities. Out of that engagement came Rita's enduring book, Searching for Life, focusing on the grandmother's quest for justice and the myriad forms it took, from the famous weekly marches circling the Plaza de Mayo, to their pioneering work in forensic genetics, to their contributions to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Of course, Rita was neither the first nor the only scholar activist to study and celebrate maternal activism in Argentina. But the importance of the topic and of Rita's approach cannot be overestimated. Her work combines several strands of primary concern: the complex legacies of dictatorships throughout the Southern Cone, what came to be called new social movements, and an approach to activism and scholarship on human rights focused on gender and childhood. In recent years, these areas of scholarship have helped transform, even redeem, the field of Latin American studies from its Cold War origins. I like to think so, anyway. My own area of research is family history. Now, even other scholars sometimes ask me why I study the family, when there are other far more important, more political topics. That is, of course, a question that scholars of gender frequently hear, whether spoken or tacit. Rita's activism and scholarship provide a ringing answer. The family is political and key to our understanding of politics on an intimate, national, and global scale. Her attention to the grandmothers centered on families. Her study embraces the complex interactions among 3 generations of family members as family relations were projected onto national and international politics. The Argentine military regime was brutally astute. State terrorism was a family affair. The regime attempted to conceal the family origins of the identities of those victims' children, and the identities of their victims' children were stolen and concealed. Surviving children lost their parents. The loss of 2 younger generations inflicted searing emotional torture on the older survivors. Like Picasso's Guernica, that represents the appalling moment when aerial bombers targeted civilians, Rita's scholarship spotlights the ravages brought about by the deliberate politics of targeting the institution of the family by depriving political enemies of the satisfaction of family bonds across generations. The inspiring choice of the grandmothers, acting as caregivers first and later as caregivers of the nation, was to expose that brutality, to seek justice for its victims, and an end to impunity of its perpetrators. Now, closer to home, I would also like to say a few words about Rita's contributions to Latin American studies here at UMass Boston. Every year, I teach Rita's book in my introductory course. I teach the book because it is accessible to students at the introductory level, because it is a way to teach about gender and social movements, and because it is a way to teach that rises above stereotypes in teaching about the importance of family in Latin America. I also teach Rita's book so that a new generation will know what happened and will not forget. Rita was unfailingly generous to the Hispanic Studies Department, as we used to be called, in the Latin American Studies program, and to our students. She never declined an invitation to speak to students about her book and its larger context, whether in a small classroom setting or a larger forum. And at times we could only offer parking and lunch as an honorarium. She and her partner, Estelle Dish, helped bring representatives of the grandmothers to campus to speak to our students. The last time they came, members of Hijos, the organization formed by restituted grandchildren, accompanied them. It was a very powerful meeting. I am proud that UMass Boston awarded the grandmothers an honorary degree in the year 2000. For today's student, 2000 was a long time ago. The 1970s, ancient history. But every year at some point, I will see a student from a previous class, a previous year, who, without fail, speaks of the powerful experience of learning about the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Thank you, Rita. When I teach your book, I feel like you are teaching by my side.
I'd like to bring greetings from somebody who helped make the book possible. Oftentimes we don't realize that there are editors out there that can say no to a manuscript or yes to a manuscript, and then sell it inside the press to convince the other people at the publishing house to publish it. And this is Naomi Schneider. Naomi's also my editor, and so Naomi always talks about how important Rita was to her. That is, as we forget that editors are also affected by very strong, powerful book manuscripts, even when they're in typescript. So Naomi Schneider also sends her greetings today, because she really sees Searching for Life as one of the most powerful books that she's had the privilege to publish with the University of California Press. Our last speaker before our main speaker is Daniel Ortiz, and Daniel is the University Librarian for University of Massachusetts, Boston. Daniel, welcome.
Well, I don't come alone. I'm coming with Joanne Ryder, who's sitting right there. My role here is very, very small. I have been fortunate to be entrusted by Federico and Estelle to look at the legacy that Rita has left us, and we're hoping that in the near future, by the fall, we would have the opportunity to unveil a digital library that is going to recognize the work that Rita has done. Actually, Estelle is helping us with that, and we hope to work with other departments on campus to have that become a reality and be able to unveil the legacy that we have, making Rita's work continue for generations to come. We will have, again, a celebration, and I hope that you're able to come. I'll be sure that we use your today so we can reach to you and get to see all the wonderful books that Rita and Federico donated to us, to the library, that actually speak very loudly of the kind of person she was, who really believed in human rights and really searched for an identity that sometimes all of us search for. And it is a very unique legacy to be able to have that. And thank you, Federico. Thank you, Estelle. And I hope that you can join us at that unveiling.
Wow. One of the things you can see if you didn't have the opportunity to know Rita personally is that she mobilizes you. You don't get to sit still if Rita is in your life. You have to take part. You have to find some way to put your oar in the water. And if you don't have an oar, she'll help carve one for you. So all of us are being mobilized here by Rita today, even with her being here. I just saw Jean Hardesty, one of her other great mobilizers, come into the room. So this is a very, when we're finished here, be sure to introduce yourself to somebody sitting next to you that you don't know, because this room is full of amazing people. And that's a tribute to Rita. So don't leave the room without having said hello to somebody you don't know, because it will really surprise you as to, who you're sitting with. It's now my enormous pleasure to introduce Lisa Baldez. Lisa Baldez is professor of history and political science and at Dartmouth College. She is also at Dartmouth the chair of Latin American Studies. I know Lisa because we both plow the good ground of politics and gender, and she has really helped transform the political science discipline and push it to not only think more about gender in politics, women in politics, but to think about those things globally. Lisa is the author of several books. One of them is called Why Women Protest, which is about the women's movement in Chile, both under Pinochet and after Pinochet. She has also been writing about women and politics, or political women and American democracy. She's a very accomplished person, but she also is somebody that is subverting in the most positive sense. Lisa, it is delightful to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you to the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights. Thank you to Carol Cohn. Thank you to Sandra McAvoy and all the interns who've invited me here and helped my trip be organized, which has been very nice. I'm really touched to have been invited to this, to speak to you all. I have been teaching Rita's book, Searching for Life, for a long time, and in fact, I'm teaching it tomorrow in my class. And it's a book that means a lot to me. You know, there are a lot of books that you can teach out there. Thankfully, there are a lot of excellent books on the field of gender and Latin American politics. But this is the one that I stick with, and all the other books kind of move around. Because this book ultimately is a message of, there's a strong message of hope in this book. And to pull that off, to pull off a message of hope while talking about such a grim subject is really quite remarkable, and it's a real testament. And I also think anybody that Cynthia Enloe would describe as having a lot of energy is probably quite a woman. So I'm going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I will. I'd love to hear your comments and questions and who you are. So I'm going to organize this talk. Can everybody hear me okay? Way back, thanks. 4 questions. One is, what is the official story about what was happening in Argentina in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, during the military dictatorship? How did the mothers and grandmothers respond? And I thank you, each of the previous speakers who talked about the book, Searching for Life, the context of the military dictatorship that was happening in Argentina that does some of the legwork for me. And I'm really riffing off Searching for Life in this talk. How did the mothers and the grandmothers respond to what was happening in Argentina? How did they respond to that official story? And how did they transform the global human rights landscape? And that's a very strong claim. So I want to talk about how they did that and then conclude by what explains their success. So what was the official story? You've got a little piece of it. And here's a picture of the military coup that took, the military junta that took power in 1976 in Argentina. It's a very impressive military-looking group of men in front of a national symbol. And the official story here was that Argentina was in chaos, economically and politically, that Argentina was under siege by subversives, and that Argentina needed to be kind of cleaned up and order needed to be reestablished. And that was something that the military saw itself as fit to do, in no small part due to the training that they received from the United States in terms of counterinsurgency tactics in various military establishments in the United States and in Panama. Now, it's certainly possible to tell the official story based on everything we know about Argentina, but remarkably, this is the same general. You can see, I don't think I have a clicker, but the man in the middle with the mustache and the funny, odd glasses is this man. And you can see that this is a YouTube video from April 13th, and today is April 17th. So this is the same man. He's now serving a life term in prison. And this video, and you can see it on YouTube, it's in Spanish, so I didn't want to show it, is an interview that was conducted with him last December and released on the 13th, Friday the 13th, in which he confesses to his involvement in the dirty war in Argentina. And so, to explain to you the official story of what happened in Argentina, I took some statements from this interview, and I translated them into English. But I thought, what a remarkable opportunity to have some quotes from this interview. And he is completely unremorseful, unrepentant, and the quotes are quite chilling and will no doubt provoke quite some controversy. So here's the first one, in which, and these are quotes from that interview that's now available on YouTube. Our objective was to discipline an anarchical society with respect to Peronism, which was kind of the major popular political ideology, to put behind us a populist and demagogic vision of politics with regard to the economy, to go to liberal market-based economy. We also wanted to discipline syndicalism, or put an end to weaken the labor unions, and to prebendal capitalism. Prebendal is a word that doesn't really translate into English all that well. It refers to kind of patronage politics, where you give your votes to someone in exchange for a goodie. That goodie could be an apartment building, a turkey at Christmas, and that was how capitalism was practiced in Argentina. It was very political. So that's a fairly straightforward description of what the Argentine military saw as its mission. A very important part of the official story was that this was a war. That this was not a matter of some instability, political instability, or some temporary chaos. This was a war of the Argentine nation against a subversive cancer. And there was a language of cancer was used quite frequently. And the military was going to extirpate this cancer by using very wide margins. In every war, this is again a quote from General Videla, in every war people are crippled, killed, and disappeared, their whereabouts unknown. That is a fact. So, as of 2012, he's continuing to see this as a war. How many there were can be debated, but the problem does not lie in the number, but in the fact, a fact which occurs in every war, that we allowed the pejorative term of disappeared to remain as a term to cover up something dark that was wanted to be kept secret. And that is what is weighing, that there is something dark which has not been sufficiently cleared up. He addresses the interviewer, who is a journalist who wrote a book about Videla, asked him about the children who were kidnapped and adopted, it's not quite the right word, by military families and by families sympathetic to the military. And Videla responds, I am the first to admit, at this time, during the Dirty War, children were taken, some with the best intention that the child would go to a good unknown home, but it was not a systematic plan. So it's not a systematic plan that hundreds of children were taken and given to military families. The logic that was used at the time was that these children needed to go to families who were not subversive, that they needed to be raised by families who would train them to be good, loyal citizens. So there actually was more of a systematic plan, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is his version of the official story. On the disappearances, he says, there was no other solution. We agreed that that was the price to win the war against subversion, and that we needed it not to be evident, so that society didn't notice. For that reason, to avoid provoking protests inside and outside the country, it was decided that those people disappear. Each disappearance can certainly be understood as the cover-up of a death. And there I think that's a very important statement. He's saying all the disappeared are dead. And they never used to say that before. They'd always say, oh, they disappeared, they're living under a false name, they got a new wife, they moved to Paris. He never acknowledged that there were disappearances, and so now he's acknowledging that these people were killed. So there's a lot more that we could say about this official story, but I just find it remarkable and quite chilling that it is so recent and shows so little evolution in thinking. So how did the grandmothers and the mothers respond? Now here I'm taking these three categories from the book, and it might be the same chapter that was referenced earlier, but these are three of the chapter headings in the chapter from Searching searching for life, facing terror, challenging the official story, and coming together. And I'll talk about each one of these categories. So this makes them distinctive, because a lot of people did not respond to the disappearance of a loved one in this way. So facing terror. This is a quote from Rita's book from one of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Berta Shubaroff, when soldiers came to her house and held her at gunpoint to demand where her son was. And she says, recalling the incident, "I answered a question that I had asked myself all my life and about which I felt a lot of shame. The question was, would I be willing to give my life for my children? I did not want to face that question. I have always been afraid of dying, but that day I was able to answer it. I felt a great happiness. I realized that they would get nothing from me. Let them kill me." And that gives you a sense of this fearlessness, of looking this fear in the eye, which is interesting. She doesn't describe it as a fear of being killed by the military. It's a fear of, would she be willing to give her life for her children? That is an anterior question to this moment. It's a question that, as a mother, she had already asked herself, and now presented with that option, she said absolutely. And I think this is an important part of what made these organizations so powerful, is that women had already lost they'd already confronted their greatest fear, and that was their children being seized and taken from them without any information. They'd faced that fear, and they were empowered to take incredible risks because they'd already faced their greatest fears. This is a picture of Berta Shubaroff's. This is her son and her daughter-in-law, both of whom were disappeared. Their remains were eventually found. Maria Claudia was pregnant at the time that she was abducted. She was 7.5 months pregnant. At the time that Rita wrote the book, her granddaughter had not been found. But her granddaughter was found, and there you have a picture of Berta Shubaroff, her granddaughter Macarena, and her husband Juan Gelman. So, that's not Berta? No.
FYI.
Got it off the internet.
Okay.
Sorry. I thought it was a really cool story, but we'll have to do some digging to confirm that. Okay.
Val has a good relationship with both of them.
Good. Thank you. Tough audience. Okay. Challenging the official story. So you heard what the official story was. What these women said were, we're not subversives. And they were called, when I was in Argentina, I did my senior thesis research as a college coming into senior year on the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. So this has deep personal roots for me. I could give a lecture just about all the trouble I got into doing that research in Argentina in the 1980s. But a lot of people in Argentina said, well, those women are the mothers of terrorists. They are terrorists themselves. And they said, no, we're not. We're just mothers. Our children were, some of them were involved in organizations, but other ones of them were doing what we might call social service work, community work. And that was justification enough for them to be seized. We want our children, we want to find out what happened to our children, and we want them back alive. Aparición con vida is what we want. And we want the world to know what's happening here. And those kind of questions about challenging the official story is what made them realize that they were not alone, and they began to come together. Now, there's an aspect of the mothers that is so powerful, and this really hasn't been sufficiently examined in relation to other kinds of similar organizations, and that is the white headscarves that the women wore. Now, if you've ever been to Buenos Aires, you will know that it's an incredibly fashionable city. No one is wearing headscarves unless maybe at this point in time they do so for religious reasons. But mothers in Argentina do not wear, in Buenos Aires, do not wear headscarves. And none of these women would have worn headscarves prior to joining this organization. So this is not, something they typically did. This was a strategic move. And in doing so, they chose a very powerful, very simple, and really globally understood symbol of motherhood. And this marked them in a particular way. And it got people's attention visually. So there's a theatrical, a performed aspect of their motherhood. It's not that that wasn't completely, genuinely, truly felt and experienced, but the scarf as a symbol was very powerful. The last aspect of how the mothers and the grandmothers responded was the coming together piece. Now, this quote, I actually read this quote to my students after 9/11 because I wanted to provide a message of hope, of what do you do when you don't know what else to do. And, you know, I have on my book, the little post-it note is still there. I saw that others had gone through even worse things. I realized that I was not the only one who was suffering. I said to myself, the best thing here is to struggle together. All these other women are also suffering. There are many of us, and that gave me strength. I learned how to keep fighting. We are united here by our problems, our pain, and our hope. When I was alone, I was lost. I did not really understand what was going on. And it's this aspect of not being alone, not trying to address this by herself, not isolating herself, which many, many people in the similar situation, in the exact situation in Argentina did. But what was distinctive about the mothers is that they came together. And an acknowledgement, and I think this is a powerful message, that when you're confronted with something so difficult, you can't handle it by yourself. And that coming together is really an important first step. They marched on the Plaza de Mayo. And this is a photograph. This was taken in 1981. It's in front of the Casa Rosada, the pink house, as opposed to our White House, which is the pink palace in the center of Buenos Aires. You can see, you'll get a better sense, those white lines are kind of like the spokes of a wheel, the spokes of a circle. And we see that. This is a very powerful image of that circular procession that every Thursday from 1977 until a couple of years ago, the women marched every Thursday from 3:30 until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's something very powerful, almost spiritual, about this, this kind of, this walking in a circle around this object. The Plaza de Mayo is not any plaza in Buenos Aires. It is the main central plaza of the city, and it is a highly politically charged, symbolic space. I just want you to note where the location of that pyramid is, because in the next couple of slides I'm going to show you protests that took place in the Plaza de Mayo that are very significant protests, that in choosing to protest here, they are marking themselves as an extension of those earlier expressions of kind of mobilization, but transforming that space. So here's a march from the Plaza de Mayo in 1955. This is the march. Have you ever seen the movie Evita? This is the march depicted in Evita when we know, of course, Antonio Banderas is singing. And there's the pirámide, there's the pyramid. So you get the sense and this was a big deal in 1955 for these people, the shirtless ones, kind of the dirty brown people from the Argentine perspective, coming out of the hinterlands into the city of Buenos Aires was highly symbolic. And it was what Peronism meant for so many people. Here we have another protest in 1974, another very significant protest, and you can see that the pyramid is there in the background. So this gives you a sense for that it's not just any plaza. It is the central plaza. It's the equivalent of the March on Washington within Argentina. And this was a self-conscious move on behalf of the mothers and later the grandmothers. So just turning to the 4 questions, you've gotten a little bit of sense of what's the official story, how the mothers and the grandmothers responded, but what was it, or what did they do that indicates that they transformed the global human rights landscape, and then ultimately what explains their success. Many accounts of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo argue that their appeal to motherhood in a patriarchal society where the mother is almost a sacred, venerated individual protected them from repression. This is not true. This is a claim that many people make, but it was not true in the case of the mothers. Motherhood did not protect the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo from repression. And the first three women that you see on the top row of photographs, Esther Carriaga, Mary Bianco, and Azucena de Vicente, were women who were members of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who were disappeared in 1977, in December of 1977, while they were having a meeting of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in a church. The group had been infiltrated, and all of these people were seized at the same time, and those three were members of the organization who disappeared. So very early on in the life of this organization, women were subjected to the same kinds of repression that other individuals were subjected to. So motherhood did not protect them. There was no space. There was no case in which a soldier or military were afraid to repress them because they were mothers. They were not afraid. The woman to the right of Azucena, Leonie Duquette, and the woman second from the right on the bottom, Alice Doman, were French nuns, and who were also disappeared during the same instance. And the disappearance of foreign citizens and the fact that they were nuns led France and other countries to become very involved in interrogating the Argentine government about what happened. It became very important. In 1979, there was a very important visit of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to document what was happening with regard to human rights in Argentina. And here you have a picture of Edmundo Vargas, who was head of that commission, speaking with members of the organization. And the report that they wrote was incredibly important in terms of providing a voice and a globally recognized outlet for documentation of violations of human rights that were occurring. Edmundo Vargas, I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, and when he left Chile in, I don't remember the year, but I was in 8th grade, he moved to Bethesda, and his son, who was really cute, and I became really good friends. And there's kind of a story in there about maybe why I got so interested in Latin America. We remain very good friends to this day. So that's a personal take on it, but the important political piece is that they were able, through the visibility of their protest, to attract global attention to what was happening in Argentina. Earlier somebody mentioned the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And these slides are a little bit, they could be ordered somewhat differently. But the grandmothers, through their work of connecting the children who had been kidnapped and restituting them back to their biological families, became very involved in the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And especially in these particular articles, Articles 7, 8, and 9, Article 7, the child shall be registered immediately after birth and shall have a right from birth to a name, to acquire a nationality, and the right to know and be cared for by his parents. Article 8 is particularly important. States parties, those who sign the convention, shall undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity. Now, this is a very powerful claim, that the child has a right to know who he or she is. And this was language that was put in there and as a result of negotiations and lobbying by the grandmothers in participating in this process. And then Article 9, states parties shall ensure that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will, except when competent authorities subject to judicial review determine in accordance with the law and procedures that such a separation is necessary for the best interests of the child. So, I mean, this is fairly standard legal language, legal expectations, but it's affirming that the child has a right to legal process, to due process, with regard to his relationship with his parents. Or her parents. Once Argentina signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Argentine government, they didn't automatically adopt, so to speak, this law into Argentine domestic law. And so the grandmothers were very influential in getting Argentina to revise its adoption laws. And here we have a key aspect of that law. The adoptee has the right to know his or her true biological identity and can access his or her adoption records upon turning 18 years old. So what this tells you is that adoptions in Argentina are open, and that at 18 years of age, a child has the right to read his or her adoption file and to discover the identity of his or her biological parents, which is not the case. State law in the United States varies on a state-by-state basis. But here, the importance of this law stems directly to the situation of the kidnapped children. And those of you who read The New Yorker, there was a recent article about what's called the Klein case, where there were 2 children of the heiress of the leading newspaper in Argentina who have long been suspected to be children who were kidnapped and adopted by this family in 1976. And it's a fascinating article that reveals a lot about the complexities of individual cases of restitution of children to their biological families. Another way in which the grandmothers had an impact on the global human rights landscape is through, as someone mentioned before, the use of DNA testing and genetic testing in the case of identifying the remains of bones discovered in unmarked graves where those who were disappeared were buried. And so this in Spanish says, if you have a relative who was a victim of disappearance, a forced disappearance between 1974 and 1983, a simple test of your blood can help you identify them. And it gives you a phone number to call and the name of the organization that oversees this, and this is run by the government. So this connects you to what's called the National Genetic Database. And through the efforts of the grandmothers in particular, they've sought to get everybody who has any knowledge about a family member who has disappeared to donate their blood to the data bank, to put themselves into the database, so that if remains are discovered, they can identify the identity of people, and also to help them in the restitution of kidnapped children to their biological families. And the grandmothers were pioneers in this regard. I mean, when we think about where DNA testing is now and what we know about genetics now, it's hard to imagine how revolutionary this was and how new DNA testing was in the 1980s, and what a radical move this was to use this technology for this greater social good. And that's something that Rita talks about a lot in her book, and I think it's another thing that keeps me so close to this book, is that it's a really powerful message about the uses of science for human rights, to further human rights. This is an unmarked grave that was discovered last month, not very long ago, in Tucumán, Argentina. From this grave, you can see the different skeletal remains there, and I apologize, those of you who work in the field of human rights, you may or may not be immune, or not immune, but more familiar with images like this. I kind of go through periods where it shocks me and then it doesn't shock me at all. What's remarkable is that 3 of the people here who were buried were identified as those who had disappeared. Their identities have been traced, and we now are able to lower the number of those who disappeared. Last week, in another unmarked grave outside of Buenos Aires, there was a young woman whose remains were unearthed. She was identified. She was very young at the time that she disappeared. She was a student of astronomy. And a couple of years ago, out of kind of respect and to pay homage to this student who had disappeared, her colleagues named an asteroid after her. So there is an Ana Diego asteroid out there somewhere. So in terms of the impact of this group, I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. In terms of being able to well, I think one thing that's extraordinary to me is that this story continues to be ongoing. And this was last month that this grave was dug up, and these remains were identified and connected to their original identities. Were it not for the work of the grandmothers and the mothers in Argentina, this kind of thing wouldn't be happening now. It would have been forgotten, it would have been paved over, and there were many, many efforts by, especially by the Menem government in Argentina, to do exactly that, to say we are done with the past and it is time to move on. But that would preclude this kind of continuous discovery, continuous connection to this history, and learning the truth about what really happened. Now, that said, there are probably, I mean, I know several offhand, there are hundreds of mothers' movements you've never heard of. There are mothers' movements, there are mothers that come together for organizations, for causes, for issues all around the world all the time. And most of them do not succeed in transforming the global human rights landscape. So what explains why these particular movements have been so tremendous? I'm just going to show you a couple pictures of mothers' movements that you may or may not be familiar with that are operating in Latin America today. They've gotten some global attention, but they're really having a difficult time at the domestic level in their respective countries. The first is a group called Mujeres de Negro, Women of Black, that operate in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, to protest against the murders of several hundred women working in maquiladoras in Juarez. They're called Women in Black. They dress in mourning, and their symbol, kind of like the white headscarf, is the pink cross. So they have buried, planted pink crosses to remember these women. They stage funeral marches throughout the city of Juarez to remember the dead. And here's, a very graphic image. Compare that to the white headscarves of the mothers in Argentina. Here we have a pink cross with a feminist symbol and the kind of the mask, a Day of the Dead type Oaxacan mask being worn by a woman. They're using a lot of the same strategies, and they're getting international traction. But at the domestic level, they are still up against a government that, while responsive in some ways, has not done much to reverse the impunity of the government at various state levels for what's been happening to these women. There's another case, Mujeres Damas de Blanco in Cuba, which is a group that is protesting against political prisoners in Cuba, very directly following on the pattern established by the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. They wear white, they stage kind of silent vigils outside government buildings, they carry gladiolas, and they wear T-shirts emblazoned with the photographs of their loved ones who are in jail. And they've drawn a significant amount of attention to what's happening in Cuba, certainly within the United States, and especially within the very active Cuban-American community. Within Cuba, they have not gotten much traction. In fact, they have been subject to pretty intense repression. And what you're seeing here is a sit-in staged by the Damas de Blanco, and they're being attacked by their fellow citizens. And their fellow citizens are being called upon by the government to attack the women in white by saying that they are foreign traitors, they are sellouts, they are paid, they are funded by the U.S. government, and that they are not pursuing a legitimate cause. So again, within the domestic sphere, they are facing lots of challenges. These cases, for me, highlight not that the mothers or the grandmothers had an easy road in Argentina. They faced many similar kinds of challenges in their time, especially in the 1970s and early 1980s. But things were different in the world. And what I want to say, and here you'll see my political science side, the political context of that time was distinctive. It was unique. On the one hand, you had a situation in which awareness of systematic violations of human rights was on the global radar, thanks in no small part to what was happening in Chile. So the military dictatorship had inaugurated on September 11th in 1973, and that was following the government of Allende, that was followed worldwide as an example of achieving socialist revolution through peaceful means. So it already had a tremendous amount of sympathy worldwide. So when the military took over, that coup drew a lot of international criticism, more so than in other countries. I recently heard that the Soviet Union, particularly within the United Nations, was very active in drawing attention to the issue of human rights abuses within Chile as a way of challenging the United States, who had played a role in bringing that coup and supporting the military government to power. So that gives us a little more understanding of why there was such universal condemnation of human rights abuses in Chile, and particularly within the UN. There were transnational activists of people who had been exiled from other countries undergoing dictatorship in Latin America. There were hundreds of thousands of Chileans all around the world, not just in Bethesda, Maryland, who were very keenly aware of this issue and were mobilizing against human rights violations in Chile and also in Argentina. As I mentioned before, like with the French government, you have foreign countries protesting the disappearance of their own citizens at the hands of the Argentine military. So you have cases of France, Sweden, Canada, and Britain filing legal claims trying to find out through diplomatic means what had happened to their own citizens on Argentine soil. And of course, in the late 1970s, you have President Carter evincing a strong commitment to human rights in his foreign policy. So you have all these forces converging in the late 1970s that allow for a context, a global context, that is very sympathetic and very supportive of human rights causes. And it's at this moment that the UN Declaration of Human Rights, ostensible commitments to protecting human rights that had been made after World War II, all of a sudden become real in a different way. And people began to demand the actual implementation and respect for those documents that countries had signed long ago. But finally, and I think the most important thing about the success of the grandmothers and the mothers is the fact that they have been able to pass this struggle on to a new generation. And the group that I want to talk about is called Hijos, and somebody mentioned it already. It's translated into English, Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Forgetfulness and Silence. And that's the acronym is Hijos, for sons and daughters. Hijos, for the most part, are the children of those who disappeared, who have a very different relationship. They have a very different understanding of protest, but protest is very important to them. And one of the things that Hijos became famous for was a series of protests, or a technique of protest called escrache. And escrache is when they would go to the home or the neighborhood in which someone who had been accused of being a torturer or someone complicit with the military regime, who in some cases had been identified in a court of law as being guilty, but who had not received punishment or had not been found guilty. And they would stage a demonstration in front of that person's home or their neighborhood. And so here's one of their most famous ones, 30 years after the coup, on the 24th of March in 2006, an escrache against Videla, the military general whom you saw at the beginning of this talk. And there's footage of this on YouTube. It's really quite a remarkable, very creative, and very high-risk type of protest. Here's a map that was published of houses in which members of the military and people who were known to be torturers lived to help facilitate this. Now, there's a lot of things that are troubling about this. When you have a justice system that is not working properly, that you take justice into your own hands, that's troubling. I'd rather have a justice system that worked. But here you have students or children and teenagers taking this matter into their own hands and kind of calling attention to the fact. And here, this is just a final slide. If there's no justice, we'll do an escrache. We'll do this. So we want justice, but if we're not going to get justice, we're going to take matters into our own hands. They're no longer doing escraches to the extent that they were. There have been many, many changes in the Argentine justice system. As I mentioned before, General Videla is serving life imprisonment. There have been thousands of trials, thousands of cases brought forward against violators of human rights in Argentina. And Hijos continues to exist as an organization with a very different agenda. But what I find so remarkable remarkable about this is that, like the book, Searching for Life, they continue to take this struggle to a next generation. And it means that this struggle will be alive for generations to come as a testament to human capacities to survive and to maintain hope in very difficult situations. And with that, I think that's an appropriate thought to leave you with to honor Rita Arditti today. Thank you very much.
Lisa has very kindly said that she is happy to take any comments, things this makes you think of, things you'd like to ask her a little more. We have a bit of time. So are there things that you want to hear more about? Yes, hi, Rochelle.
Well, thank you very much.
Another local activist thinker.
Just for my benefit, tell me who you are.
Rochelle Ruth Chubb. Oh, thank you. This was a
Let me just tell you, the microphone that you're handed is not, no, that's okay. It doesn't amplify, it doesn't need to, but it means that you get recorded. Okay? Right.
So anyway, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I didn't know a lot of what you said, but I'm wondering if you can address the fact that across the river at that other institution, Harvard, somebody who was very central to the anti-left policies of the U.S. government, Henry Kissinger, is being honored, and honored also and given sort of an op-ed piece in the Boston Globe as a diplomat and as a statesman, shall we say. And how can we kind of combat that, I guess?
What would Rita do?
What would Rita do?
What would Rita do?
I think I'm troubled to hear that. I would suggest to Henry Kissinger that he not leave the country. No, quite seriously, I think he faces a very similar situation to Augusto Pinochet. He cannot leave the country in the security that he will not be arrested and be tried for human rights violations, and certainly in many countries of Latin America. So I really can't comment on the decisions made by Harvard University. He certainly was an influential figure in all of these things, if not a key player. But I think, you know, with anything like that, it offers an opportunity to kind of ask questions about and talk about what that legacy means in its fullest extent.
Kissinger needs an scratch.
Alicia, reminding us of.
At Harvard University.
Yes.
I would be surprised if there weren't one.
I agree. Things like that don't happen.
Yes, hi.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a really wonderful talk, and it just went into so much depth about something that I had known about for a long time, but did not know many of the different levels that you were able to illuminate.
Just say your name.
My name is Elena Stone, and I am actually. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm actually really wondering about the hijos and what you know about them and their path, and I'm thinking that it must have been incredibly traumatic for them to find out about their own history and about the deeds of the families that adopted them, and what do you know about how that was dealt with, and kind of the journey that they took, not just on a political level but on a more personal level as well.
Yeah, you know, I don't know hijos particularly. I haven't met with them. Maybe you might be able to say more. No, okay. You know, you do see. You know, I have several Argentine students at Dartmouth, and they're not necessarily the children of people who disappeared, but they are the children of people who lived through that period. And they so desperately want to know the truth. They want to be able to sift between what their parents tell them, what they learn about the United States government. They want to understand. You know, my connection to kind of how children have responded to that comes largely through a series of phenomenal films, Argentine films, that have been made about children of the disappeared coming to understand their identity. And it's just unbearably emotionally difficult, but at the same time, kind of important to go through. And it's, I'm kind of, thinking to little pieces I know about this, but about hijos in particular. I think both hijos and the grandmothers have stayed true to their one main goal, which is the restitution of these children who were kidnapped back to their biological families. The Madres split as an organization. I can't remember the year that they split, but now they see themselves as carrying on the struggle that their children carried on. So the Madres travel all over the world. They travel all throughout Argentina. I'm sure they were at the most recent summit in Cartagena, Colombia. And they have gone beyond the issue of human rights and the disappearances in Argentina to address issues of social justice more broadly. And I suspect that some of the hijos at least, have gone along with them and kind of taking up the causes that their children initially fought for, social justice, equality, and carried them on to their own. I'd love to hear from students.
Yeah.
Can I just do a PS on that?
Yes.
The grandmothers have attracted many, many young people to work in their office. They have an enormous office now, 2 floors, and you walk in there, there's a few old women and a lot of young people. So that it's siblings of the disappeared. It's the recovered grandkids themselves go and work in the office or volunteer there. They're working all day and they go in the afternoon. So that the young people are running that show now. Estela Carlota is still orchestrating the show, but in terms of the work of the office, it's done by the next generation or 2 generations. And it's fabulous to see because these old women are getting tired. They're in their 80s and 90s, and pretty soon they're not going to be here. And the young people are not going to stop.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if any of the students are ready to talk. I'm glad to take my turn. Esther Shapiro, I teach at UMass Boston. I want to say a couple of things. First, about this whole idea of when is a local movement connected to transnational or global players in ways that are effective, because I think to compare them to the Mothers in Black or the Mothers in White, and to say if you don't transform your society in a big way, you haven't succeeded. And I recommend for people who haven't ever seen this particular public health angle on mothers and other women's movements is to look at Snehendu Kaur's study of 80 exemplary women's organizations all over the world. So they give the example of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, as well as several of the impactful mothers movements, as trying to solve a local problem and doing multiple levels of organizing locally and globally. I think one of the questions is, and it's one of the things that I love about your book about the movements, is what creates a tipping point within a national space, and for what purpose? What's our purpose? So those of us who want to transform UMass Boston to make sure students' needs are taken care of would be working to organize in a different way, because our purpose is a different purpose. So I just wanted to say that even if you don't succeed in downing the Castro brothers or in solving impunity in Mexico, there are still important things about that level of organizing. So I just wanted to say that there's a lot of different ways to study those processes and how we make an impact locally. But I just wanted to ask, is there anybody here who knows Rita's cancer activism? I didn't see anybody speaking to that, and so I feel like, as someone who has studied her life with great admiration, and because I teach and work in health promotion as a mobilization strategy for political change, is there anybody else who can say a little something about that? One of the most amazing experiences of my life was to listen to Rita. I mean, she lived with a cancer diagnosis for many years, and it transformed her into a critic of biomedicalization of life and an activist to question what does it mean to be told by doctors who think they know, who we are, that the best way to heal from cancer is to have a poison that will kill you.
We do have two people here. Jean, you want to say just a little something?
Well, so
because it is another part of Rita's politics. So maybe Jean could just.
Yeah. So I wanted to say that as someone who was very inspired by her ability to take her life, her science, and her politics and put those together in ways that inspired such a variety of social movements. And I hope that when we do the library collection, in addition to the abuelas and madres and hijos, that we will also have some opportunity to study her activism, because I think there's huge lessons in it for all of us. So I just wanted to add that to the library proposal.
This is Jean Hardesty, who is an activist in many ways.
The relevance of my comments here is that I'm a member of the Women's Community Cancer Project, of which Rita was a founding member. And I couldn't put it more eloquently than it's already been put, that was a bringing together for her of her science, her activism, her feminism, all of it. But I'll tell you one story. We did a lot of demonstrating against the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry in particular, and the complete neglect of women's cancers. We forget that it wasn't that long ago that any cancer having to do with women was ignored. And it was also true in heart disease, by the way. Women were not studied around the issue of heart disease. We did that for about 7 or 8 years, I would say, and the issue got onto the page of the public consciousness. And in some ways, we had done what we came to do. And we were casting about a little bit, and Rita, in her very quiet but determined way, started nudging us toward the issue of cancer and the environment, on the grounds that this is a disease that is not individually based. Although as individuals, I myself am a person with cancer, we tend to think that somehow it's something we did or it's something we have to deal with. It's between us and our doctors, whatever. And Rita's constant quiet message to us was, this is environmentally based. And until we understand that, we're directing our protest to the agents that are acting on our medical condition, but we're not directing our protest to the cause. And we eventually, because she was so quiet, so persuasive, so charismatic, we changed our focus toward cancer and the environment. And the organization has been focused that way ever since. And across the country, women's cancer organizations are now focused that way. And it's because of Rita.
Thanks, Jean. Any other thoughts or questions or? Yes, hi.
Hi. My name is Dottie Stevens. I really don't need this.
No, but you're going to get recorded.
Anyway.
That's for posterity.
Oh, okay. And I'm here to honor Rita and her work. I didn't get into working with Rita till just, I don't know, not too long ago. And I was into human rights. And she was working on human rights. And how we connected locally and nationally and globally is organizing through this paper, Survival News. And she was working on making Boston a human rights city before she died. And so we kept on, and we made Boston a human rights city last April. And I just want to thank her for all her support. She was a very big supporter with Estelle.
If you're interested in feminism, politics, and women and welfare, or what's left of welfare, talk to Dottie.
Diane Dutrell.
Yes, and Diane as well. Any other thoughts or? Yes, hi.
I wanted to comment a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. My name's Kelly Reddy. I'm from Brandeis, and I worked many years with the Committee of Mothers of the Disappeared, the Comadres in El Salvador. And so I wanted to question a little bit your complete kind of dismissal of the motherhood as creating space. Because while I agree that the motherhood did not protect the comadres or the mothers in Argentina or the comadres in El Salvador, their offices were bombed there, but it definitely, I think that women consciously use that role as something that would give them some space. And so I just wanted to, see if you had anything to say.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think maybe there's a middle ground, but I was trying to talk about the mothers and the grandmothers to someone that really didn't know anything about them, and they were like, "Well, how are they able to do that?" And I kind of trotted out the argument about this protective space of motherhood, and then I realized, like, no, they weren't protected; they just kept going. And so I think there was something internally and collectively for them very powerful about it. And it's not, I don't mean to say that motherhood was purely strategic, because it wasn't. It was very authentic, very powerful emotionally. It was what catapulted them into this uncomfortable position. But the idea that there's something so sacred about motherhood in Latin American countries that soldiers will keep a wide berth of women is preposterous. 30% of the people who disappeared were women. They disappeared pregnant women. They had no respect for motherhood. So I think I want to retain it as an internally powerful motivator, and also as something that resonates universally. But it won't. It doesn't. It didn't kind of. There was no force field that protected them from repression. But thank you for pointing that out.
Yes, in the back. Hi.
I'm currently taking a course in human rights in Latin America, and my question was that you mentioned the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and I wanted to expand a little bit more on the work that they accomplished with this case, and what were the reactions of the grandmothers, mothers, and these people who now form families?
Hijos, yeah. I was looking at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and wanted to see, where did their visit to Argentina fit in context of their work overall. The commission was formed in 1948, I believe, and they did a couple of visits, from 1948 until 1970, maybe 3 or 4. But it wasn't until the 1970s, it wasn't until 1973, when they started going to Chile on a regular basis to collect information about the systematic violation of human rights, that they took on the role that they now have as a regional, a very important institution in terms of protecting human rights. And I think that has to do with some of the things I talked about, the political context of the 1970s, the role that highly politicized, highly educated Chileans played in using these institutions in new ways, and not just at the level of the Organization of American States, not just at the regional level, but also within the United Nations, that brought life and force to those institutions to say, we signed this commitment to human rights, and we signed the Convention Against Genocide, decades ago, but we really mean it, and we're really holding you accountable to those international claims, those international standards of human rights. And that's something that changes in the 1970s with regard, and that's where you begin to see what we now think of as the kind of international law and international norms about human rights emerging in response to these regimes and their systematic violation of human rights that that it wasn't working that way before. And there certainly had been military governments in Latin America prior to the 1970s. But you get a change in institutions and in people's willingness to demand that those institutions kind of put backbone behind the claims about protection of human rights that they had made many decades ago. Is that?
The reactions.
Oh, the grandmother's reactions? You know, what's interesting is that when I was, now as a student and I spent time with the mothers, what amazed me was how uncompromising they were. So they were not terribly pleased because it didn't return their children. And so that was insufficient. And most things were insufficient. Most measures, all the things I talked about, have been insufficient because it has not returned their children. And that's a very difficult position. You're either completely with them on that, or you're gonna hear about it from that organization. And that's what caused the split within the organization. This very uncompromising commitment. Some people thought we need to stay being about the disappeared. Other people thought, no, we need to take this organization and go kind of broader in terms of social justice claims. But their response was they had a very difficult agenda to meet, and that visit of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights didn't meet it. So they were, what's the word? Dismissive of that. As with many other things that you might consider a victory, or at least a small step forward, it wasn't enough for them, and in a good way.
Yeah, Ben.
I suppose I should say a few words being Rita's son. And just that, I knew my mother from the time I was born. And I can assure you there was a time before, what I would call the getting of consciousness in my mother's life, where she was a rather conventional, mainstream kind of woman, and it was coming to America to a large degree that led her to feminism and eventually the fight for human rights and social justice. And as all kids do, we rebel against our parents. So I became a very unpolitical person over the course of my life, and kind of stepped away from a lot of the things she fought for. But I did get a front row seat to her story in a very sort of osmosis kind of subtle way, gradually over decades. And after she passed away, I started looking at a lot of the things that she, fought for, including her struggle with cancer, which, by the way, so many of her books at Richdale have ended up, I hope, here. I recall boxing those books and getting them to the campus here. And yeah, her work in that field, as well as the stuff that everybody else has spoken about, is a hard act to follow, frankly. And so over time, what has happened to me is that in the last couple of years, I've become somehow very interested in the things that she fought for, in a kind of like, well, somebody's got to sort of do something now that she's not here. Somebody has to continue this kind of work. And I found myself suddenly reading about Martin Luther King, and his autobiography, and just the civil rights movement from soup to nuts, watching Eyes on the Prize, and just becoming as educated and as informed as I possibly could. And so all I can say, not just for myself, but to the youth here, is that the work continues. That's it. Thank you.
And none of us know our parents. Yes, one last question over here.
A comment, please.
Oh, and a comment. Good.
Hello. Thank you. I'm Louis Frank. I teach ESL here at UMass. Most of my students are from China and Saudi Arabia, which are pretty interesting places to talk about human rights. and I agree, the work continues and we have to keep teaching what we know to keep educating people who need to know these things so that they don't happen again. And I actually taught about, not about Rita, not about your mother, I taught about the dirty war today in class. You guys maybe saw my students leaving.
Yeah.
Those were my students leaving halfway through. My question to everyone and to you is, how important is the tipping point? I haven't read your book, but is the tipping point the time where there are desaparecidos? And I have a personal connection to Colombia, and there it seems like there are human rights abuses happening all the time, but there's no military junta which is bringing light. And we do see in Syria now there is this there's kind of a revolution happening. Are we only going to see progress in human rights after the Syrian government does all the bad that it can do? Or is there a way to do it?
I'm sure someone else can take that question.
I guess my question is kind of vague, but my question is, can there be progress in human rights before the human rights are violated?
I counted like 4 questions in there. The tipping point, just to clarify, thank you for mentioning that. So I have a book in which I compare right-wing women's movements and left-wing women's movements. And my question is, under what conditions do women mobilize as women? And when does a women's movement come together? And it very much in my research has to do with the political context. And I'm kind of rethinking that. I wrote the book, 10 years ago. But the argument is basically when you have political cleavages, when you have, Democrats and Republicans kind of competing for congressional seats, when you have hardliners and softliners in a military regime, when you have parties kind of forming new alliances, that's a moment in which a movement can come together as a movement. So lots of diverse groups that previously would have battled over strategy or tactics or goals all of a sudden come together because there's this space. The thing I think that's so important about Rita's book is that she shows that it's, okay, maybe that's a piece of it, but it's really the individual empowerment comes through so clearly in her book, and that's, to me, what makes it distinctive. So that movement, the questions about failure or success is also a question about that participation transformed individual lives, and that's what people read when they that's what they take away when they read that book, is that I can do this too. Do we have to wait for human rights to be violated in order to demand human rights? No. I mean, no. I think that's kind of what the last 20 years have been all about in terms of human rights, is we need to keep talking about these things. We need to keep these issues alive. We need to confront what is painful and difficult and traumatic in order to raise people's awareness of it, and then at every single level, at the local level, at the state level, at the municipal level, at the global level, and demand that these things cannot pass.
One last comment, then we'll break up and everyone can talk with each other.
What you did just now really described Rita. She was a local, national, worldwide person. The thing that Rita really believed in was something called the Precautionary Principle, and that has to do with when there's indication of harm, we must act. And that's how she felt about the cancer movement. And the name of the cancer movement that she founded is called the Women's Community Cancer Project. Very grassroots. It's in Cambridge, but it's going to be featured, mentioned. Someone from the group will be interviewed in a documentary. It's a Canadian-based documentary. It's going to be coming to Brookline, Coolidge Corner Theater in June. It's called Pink Ribbons, Inc., and it shows a rally of the Women's Community Cancer Project. So Women's Community Cancer Project, I'll be quick, but was really one of the first organizations that linked environmental toxins to cancer. And it was the strong link of it, and letting people become aware that it does not have to go generation to generation. We can take a look at the causes and how we can prevent cancer. And she was a mentor to me and to many people, and you know, in our hearts. And we're carrying on with the Women's Community Cancer Project.
I want to thank Lisa Baldez for coming. And I want to thank all of you who knew Rita or were inspired by Rita or who are about to be inspired by Rita for coming. Remember, before you leave the room, you're going to say hello to somebody you don't know. That's Rita. Okay? Thank you all very much.